Hello, this is Simon Brew.
Now I remember.
I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine and... Oh, sorry about this commotion. I only asked them to start the podcast. Oh, what are you doing? Can we just get going? Sort it out.
8.
Let's rock and roll.
About time.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, we're here to talk of the stories of film. Title gives it away. We talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs really that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're movies I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. Just here to celebrate films, the fact films are made. It's really hard to make films, and I just want to salute the people who managed to get them over the line. I'd cover 2 films every episode, and I'm just going to get on with the first, if that's all right. I think that's enough preamble. What I'm going to do is play you a clip from the first of the 2 movies. We're going back to the 1990s for this one. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
In his nightmares, he can see them. In his mind, he can hear them.
Locutus.
In his soul, he can feel them.
I've just received a report from Deep Space 5. Long-range sensors have picked up...
Yes, I know. The Borg. Set a course for Earth. Maximum warp.
Now, in Earth's darkest hour, he must fight them again.
Captain, Earth. Life signs?
Population approximately 9 billion. All Borg.
How?
Time travel. They went back and assimilated Earth. Changed history. I must follow them back. Repair whatever damage they've done.
But this time, they must travel to the past.
April 4th, 2063.
To save our future.
You're all astronauts on some kind of Star Trek.
That then was a clip from 1996's Star Trek First Contact, directed by Jonathan Frakes, with a screenplay by Brannon Braga and Ronald D. Moore, story by Rick Berman, as well as Braga and Moore. The cast for this one: Patrick Stewart, Jonathan Frakes, Brent Spiner, LeVar Burton, Michael Dorn, Gates McFadden, Marina Sirtis, Alfred Woodard, James Cromwell and Alex Krieg. And well, the story of it began with, inevitably in Star Trek land, the previous Star Trek movie, which had been Star Trek Generations. Now, Generations had been a film where it really had some pressure on it, really. That it was released in 1994, and it had been the first Star Trek movie to cross over the casts of the TV show. So, appreciating there are people who have far more expertise than Star Trek than me, I'm just going to give the basics of this here. That the original Star Trek series, led by William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, spawned 6 films, concluding with Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Then, at the same time, the television series Star Trek The Next Generation was taking off, led by Patrick Stewart and Jonathan Frakes. And so what Paramount Pictures was up against really was how to continue Star Trek on the big screen. That the 6th Star Trek movie had ended, I mean, metaphorically and figuratively, with them signing off their signatures on the screen, knowing that it was an end of an era. But Paramount, when it was putting Generations together, wanted to maximise the possible appeal of the film and have some degree of crossover between the old Star Trek series and the new. And that kind of bracketed in the creative team of this one: producer Rick Berman, writer Ronald Moore and writer Brannon Braga. And as such, they fashioned with Generations a film that kept William Shatner's Captain James T. Kirk and brought in the Next Generation crew, and there was something of a passing of the torch going on there. Now, what Generations didn't do was really appeal beyond the core Star Trek fan base. In fact, at that point, there hadn't been a Trek film, as good as some of them have been, since Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, which is the one where they time travel and find some whales on Earth, that had crossed over to a broader audience. And so once Generations was done, there was a feeling that, this was Star Trek's pocket, really, that there was a limit to how much Star Trek could make, how much you'd invest in a Star Trek film, but that they were reliable performers at the box office. And so the studio head of Paramount Pictures at the time, Sherry Lansing, she made the call on this one while Star Trek Generations was still playing in cinemas and doing pretty well. She got in touch with Rick Berman, said, let's just get moving on the next one. Now, with the next one, crucially, the shackles were off. There was no longer the demand to incorporate the original Star Trek cast in this movie, that they could instead explore something off their own back without the studio mandate, well, basically closeting them in. And so Berman got in touch with Moore and Braga and to hire them to return first and foremost. And I mean, they talked about this in a recent piece at the Hollywood Reporter to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the film. And they talked there about the strict boundaries they'd had to work with before, and that this time they had a much freer hand. And there were two ideas coming from two different sources that they would ultimately unify. So Rick Berman wanted the idea of a time travel film. I mean, it had worked for Star Trek 4 for a start, but that's where he felt the next generation Star Trek crew should go next. Ronald D. Moore and Brannon Braga, well, they had a different idea because they wanted to bring to the big screen Star Trek The Next Generation's most expensive villains, the Borg. Now, the Borg was, just in terms of bringing them to the television series, was high maintenance villains, to be fair. They took a lot of special effects, they took a lot of makeup, they took a lot of time, where at a point where Star Trek was just the Next Generation series was doing, 23, 24 episodes a year. And so fitting in the Borg into that kind of production cycle was really, really tricky. Now, on the big screen, there was something there that would be a slightly longer production cycle, not much longer, but we'll come to that, a bigger budget. And so these foes that were hugely popular with the Star Trek fan base, which had been off screen for a while, in part because of just how difficult they were to realise, well, bringing the Borg to a film seemed like a logical way to go. And so Berman liked that, and the idea was fashioned of, let's do a time travel movie with the Borg in it, and everyone was happy. So this idea developed through several drafts of the screenplay, and there's extensive resources far beyond the scope of this podcast that you'll find on the making of Star Trek films that I do encourage you to seek out. The idea was that the crew of the Enterprise would go back in time to an era that the Borg too had travelled back in time to try and prevent something happening, basically. So there was some toing and froing over just where they should send the Borg in the first place. The Renaissance era was one that Patrick Stewart was not particularly keen on. And instead what they decided to zero in on was a pivotal moment in Star Trek lore, which was, in the world of Star Trek, the invention of the warp drive, which opened up all the galaxies and all the worlds and all the space travel. And so the plot would see the Borg come back to that point and try and interfere with the invention of warp drive and change history forever. Now, what this led in screenplay terms was a story that would follow two narratives. That on the surface of the Earth back in time, there was a narrative about basically trying to keep history intact, and then making sure that the invention of the warp drive carried on as planned. But also what they wanted was, on the Enterprise spaceship itself, a battle against the Borg themselves, and that's where the special effects would kick in earnest. Now, the original way that the script was penned would have seen Patrick Stewart's Captain Jean-Luc Picard on Earth and Jonathan Frakes, First Officer Riker, on the Enterprise battling the Borg. But it was Stewart who suggested turning that round, that he liked the idea of being the one on the ship doing battle, and this made sense. And so the script was duly evolved, duly moved on, and things were coming together. And they were coming together at relative speed here. Now, the problem they faced when putting the screenplay together was, well, there was plenty for fans. There was no question at all that Star Trek fans were going to be intrigued by what they did with this one. But was there really enough in there to cross over? Furthermore, the villains of the Borg took a little bit of explaining. That the fact that they had history with one or two of the characters, in particular Patrick Stewart, Jean-Luc Picard, that took a little bit of explaining too. And so on the one hand, Star Trek fans would expect it to loop in into narratives that have been explored before in the television series. On the other, if you're trying to sell it as a big Christmas blockbuster, a big sci-fi blockbuster, you don't want to get bogged down and basically need people to go on a revision course or just an induction course, really, before they could get into the film. And so they put one or two elements in there that just got around this. Notably, a briefing scene where they just explain, I mean, it's just an information dump scene that's done with some economy, to be fair. But also what they would choose to add would be a sequence right at the start of the film, and a really, really complex sequence to put together as well, that would call back to the character Jean-Luc Picard's previous experience with the Borg and basically give outsiders everything really they needed to know at that point. Now, the fact that the screenplay was pressing ahead and was evolving didn't mean that there weren't some tensions here. And in particular, Patrick Stewart, for one, was looking for rewrites of one or two of the sequences that he was in the film. And to the point where he wanted a new writer in to come and take a stab at it all. Now, Ronald Moore and Brannon Braga were not happy about this. Stewart, as the star of the ensemble, really, the lead of the ensemble, really, he got his way, and his writer came in and did some work for his character and the scenes that the character Picard was in. Now, those scenes that were written, and the writer was unnamed, were not used in the end, but still there was a little bit of ill feeling that someone else had been brought in, and that would manifest itself briefly on set, as I'm going to come to shortly. While they were still working on the script, though, there was that small problem of who on earth is going to direct this? Because what was known was that Paramount wanted this to be one of its big films for the end of 1996, that it had a date on it, that it wanted this to move forward. And by the end of 1995, whilst there was a screenplay coming together, whilst pre-production work could get underway, what there wasn't was a director on board. David Carson, who directed Generations, he was not going to do this one. And so some fairly big names were reportedly linked with the film. Ridley Scott and John McTiernan's names appear online quite a lot as being linked with directing this particular Star Trek endeavour. Now, I haven't found source news stories that absolutely confirm this, but what there does seem to be consensus around was that there were some big names, really, who were offered the Star Trek film. But conversely, bringing someone into the 8th film in a movie franchise when there were 3 or 4 television series that also put a footprint really on which way it was all going to go wasn't really of massive appeal to huge directors and directors used to putting their own worlds on screen, really. And so eventually the conversation turned to Jonathan Frakes, by this point in his early to mid 40s, and a man who acted in Star Trek The Next Generation, was a popular figure, but also had cut his teeth directing episodes of the TV show as well. Now, that was quite a leap from going from TV show to directing a movie, but there was form here in the world of Star Trek of taking members of the cast and giving them the directorial reins of a film. Go back to Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. That was directed by Leonard Nimoy, of course, played Spock in the original films. William Shatner would have a bash at directing a film as well. We must come to that on a future episode of this. He would direct Star Trek V, which didn't go down as well. Conversely, the pathfinding had been done, and the fact that Frakes knew Star Trek, the fact that he was available, the fact that he was interested, well, all these things came together really. And in January of 1996, he wasn't the first choice for the job, and he knew this. He was basically awarded the director's chair for what would become Star Trek First Contact. He was up against a hell of a deadline, but to him, it was less of a crushing deadline than he'd been used to. He'd been used to the cycle of turning around television episodes, where the preparation time was much lower, the shooting time was much lower, the post-production time was much lower. And so whereas an established director might look at this and think, I'm directing a big sci-fi film that's got to be in a screen in 10 months and not a single frame of footage has been shot, for Frakes, I wouldn't say it was luxurious, but certainly it was more space than he was used to. Matthew Leonotti, an experienced pair of hands, was brought in to shoot the film with him, and Leonotti would go off and do his homework. I mean, at this point, the TV series Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager were shooting. So Leonotti could go and do his research there. He could go onto the set of a Star Trek TV show, see how things were done, see how space travel was put across, and basically use that to inform the way that he would decide to shoot Star Trek First Contact. Not that it was called Star Trek First Contact by this point. While Frakes was off researching an assortment of science fiction films just to get him into the headspace of making this movie, and he was given a couple of months to prepare to get ready for it, the film was called, at this point, Star Trek Resurrection. I mean, it'd gone through a couple of working names, one or two that had involved the Borg as well, but Star Trek Resurrection was seen as the one to press forward with. Now, while the pre-production was underway, most of the casting for the film, of course, had been pretty much well spoken for, that it was going to be led by the crew of the Star Trek The Next Generation TV show. But there were a few spots for guest performers to come into this particular movie. Now, there were three key roles in particular that needed to be filled. One of them, internet rumours suggested at the time, was going to go to Tom Hanks. That Hanks, a well-known Star Trek fan, he was, reportedly sounded out to appear in the film, although in the recent 25-year look back at it, that was played down a little bit. He was also making his directorial debut at the time, That Thing You Do, which I've covered before on an episode of Film Stories. And so instead, the role that he had been mooted for, or at least been rumoured for, would go to James Cromwell. Cromwell at this stage in his career was riding high off the back of his Oscar nomination for the film Babe, and so he duly signed up. He would be joined too on the guest star bench by Alfred Woodard and Alice Krieg, with Krieg taking on the role of the Borg Queen, a pivotal role in this particular movie. One person who wasn't in the cast, who found out by reading the papers, was Whoopi Goldberg, who had appeared, a semi-regular in the TV show, had appeared in the big screen as well. She wanted to be in the film, wasn't reportedly best pleased when she found out that she wasn't, not least by the way she managed to find out that she wasn't. Now, filming could finally get underway on this one on the 8th of April 1996, and the release of the film was just over 7 months away at that point. One of the first things that changed in filming actually was the title of the movie, because Paramount became aware that 20th Century Fox was calling the next chapter in its Alien big screen saga Alien Resurrection. As such, it wasn't going to go with Star Trek Resurrection after all, and that's when it became Star Trek First Contact. And there was an element of a race against time from this point onwards, perhaps unsurprisingly really, that sets were still being built for the film at the point where shooting began. And so the schedule was set up that it was all the exterior filming that got underway first. So the movie started production with half a week in Arizona, for instance. Then it did a week or two in Los Angeles. And it wasn't until about a month really that they were able to actually physically get on the sets that had been built for the movie. Now, going back to the Arizona leg of the shoot, that's when Brannon Braga and Ronald Moore met Patrick Stewart again for the first time, since Stewart had asked for a different writer to come in. And as Moore told the Hollywood Reporter on this one, he said the awkwardness in the room was quickly addressed by Stewart. And he said that I remember Patrick at the outset just said something like, "It's good to see you. I hope that we can all move on from the things that have happened, and now let's just concentrate on the work." And Moore said that he took that in the spirit that he felt in which it was given. He said he wants to move on from this. He's not going to apologise outright, but he kind of is apologising, and it was never spoken of again. And so they just got back down to it. It had been dealt with. On you go. Now, the budget for Star Trek First Contact was, it was expensive by Star Trek terms. It probably isn't that expensive if you stack it up against a lot of sci-fi movies. This was the decade where Terminator 2 had cost $100 million to make. Star Trek First Contact had $45 million to play with, but that was being stretched, and heavily so. That, as Moore would say, it got to the point where they were still, just as they were with the television series, counting how many phaser beam effect shots they were able to put in parts of the movie, because Paramount had come to the project working on projections based on previous Star Trek movies, that the studio was adamant that Star Trek films can only make a certain amount of money, that they needed a certain amount of profit from the movie, and as such there was only a certain amount they could afford to spend on the film. They pushed this budget to the absolute limit. Now, there were key sequences being done as well that were being done practically too. As much as there was CG work going on here, being done by Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, there's a big sequence in the movie which takes place, basically an outdoor spacewalk on a deflector dish. And this was the kind of thing that had to be done primarily using wire work rather than computer-generated effects. That a blue screen was thrown up so that you could add the background of it afterwards, and that presented problems for director Jonathan Frakes in terms of charting the geography and getting his shots absolutely right, to know where characters were at certain points. He had tech on hand to help him with that on set. He also described that as just basically the worst bit to shoot. It took a long time to do because computers couldn't really at that stage shorten the filming of that sequence. It had to be done with wires. It had to be done with carefully plotted shots. And whereas throughout the film, Frakes had tried to keep a light tone. I mean, he really wanted to get back to the enjoyable character work in Star Trek as well. I mean, he wanted to lighten it a little bit, and all of the cast and crew that interviews that I've seen since have just said it was pretty much a joy to film this one, apart from the fact it was pushing so much against it. But he was getting the complicated shots in the can as well as he was getting the human interaction stuff. And for a first feature film, and not a small one, he wrapped it pretty much on the mark as well. That it was 2 days over schedule when the final shot was in the can on July the 2nd, 1996. The final moments that were shot were actually the first moments that you see in the film, that the decision had been made to basically do that prologue almost that introduced the previous elements from the TV series. Now, even while filming was going on, and certainly once the film heading into post-production, ILM was hard at work on those effect shots, even as Paramount Pictures' Excel spreadsheet was threatening to explode. In the meantime, also up against it was Jerry Goldsmith. Now, Jerry Goldsmith had been lured back to the franchise to score the movie. He's got the late composer, of course, has form in composing for Star Trek. He came up with a beautiful score for this. Absolutely adore the score. But he just had a couple of weeks to get this together. I mean, the story is he drafted in his son to help him out just because they were so up against it on time deadlines on this movie. Also, the backdrop, even while they were doing the edit of this, was the two then running Star Trek TV shows, Deep Space Nine and Voyager. Well, their popularity was just waning a little bit. There's a feeling that they might be running a little out of juice, that has the audience for Star Trek shows, I mean, we ask this question at this point now, when there's 3 or 4 of them running hugely successfully, but at this point, had the audience for Star Trek shows just started to dissipate? Was there really that strong a core fan base even? And Paramount was facing having to promote a film when it felt that there was a degree of Star Trek fatigue out there, but also it was struggling to engage, that's a Star Trek punch-ums, it was struggling to engage the core fans, yet alone trying to broaden the appeal to people who ordinarily would never touch a Star Trek film. Now, Paramount would have this again when it came to J.J. Abrams' reboot of Star Trek in 2009. I covered that a long time ago on Film Stories. But the way it decided to promote this film was, first of all, to be fair to it, it put quite a lot of marketing expenditure into the movie. But also the way that it promoted the film was different. This was not a promotional campaign that played to the fan base at all. That there was a feeling the fan base was going to be pretty much implicit to the audience here, not least bringing fan favourites such as the Borg in. And thus, it was just billed as a big sci-fi movie. That it was given November the 22nd, 1996 release. It premiered the week before that. It was going out into high season, and this was just billed as a big blockbuster to go and see at the cinema that just happened to be a Star Trek film. I have to say, it worked a treat as well. That the reviews for the film, I think the reviews for the film actually were good. That there were a couple of naysayers in there, but generally the critical response had been better than it was for Generations. The fact that there was more warmth to the characters was certainly cited. I remember thinking that at the time. There were good roles for the likes of Krieg, for Alfred Woodard, for James Cromwell, and also that Frakes had just captured something really. It was a good romp, 111 minutes. It came in, told its story there, but also Star Trek fans really went for this one as well. I mean, it's the old cliche, which I think has just had a few challenges to it in recent times, of odd and even-numbered Star Trek films. That the even-numbered ones were always said to be the really good ones, and the odd ones not quite as good. And this was Star Trek 8, so that means it was going to be really good, that kind of thing. Still, the response from critics was good. The response from audiences was better. And this was, it was a surprise, really. I mean, the film opened in cinemas in first place, November the 22nd to the 24th, with a $30.7 million opening weekend, the biggest opening for a Star Trek film ever at that point. The films it was in and around as well. I mean, there was quite a lot of competition, really. Space Jam had opened the week before, and that had been doing some good money. The Mel Gibson thriller Ransom was in third place. That had been hanging around for a few weeks as well. The big opener that it was up against was Arnold Schwarzenegger in Jingle All the Way, but that underperformed, really, opened with $12 million in fourth place. The other films that were around at this point were things like The Mirror Has Two Faces from Barbra Streisand, Set It Off, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet was in the top 10. First Wives Club was in the top 10 as well. And one of the Oscar-run films, Shine, also got a limited opening that same week. But Star Trek was a hit, as big a hit as it had been for some time, and Paramount Pictures was delighted. I mean, to put it into some kind of contrast, Generations had taken 75 million in America by the end of its run and 42 million outside of America. Star Trek First Contact, 92 million in America alone, a significant upgrade in audience. And by the time it had finished its run, I mean, it did another 55 million outside of the US. And it had a box office return of $146 million, but also would continue to be a strong performer on home formats as well. And it gave Paramount the confidence to basically order up more of the same, that it turned to Jonathan Frakes for the next film in the Star Trek series, which would be Star Trek Insurrection, the 9th movie. But before that, I mean, Frakes gave an interview where, I mean, he talked about his feelings of the movie to the New York Times, and he just said, I've never had a movie before, so this is kind of exciting. He said it's like the opening night of a Broadway show, and he was, even when it was put to him that not every review had been that positive, he just said it's just been incredible, and never ever have I had the kind of success as an actor as I'm having this week in my second career. And that was an interview done the week of the movie's release. And he talked about, in the same interview, about what he'd tried to do with the film. He said, we tried to bring the fun back. He said, I mean, one of the great charms of the original Star Trek was that relationship that Kirk and Spock and Bones had, where they kid each other and be ironic and sarcastic and jab each other in the ribs. And he wanted that back on the big screen, and he got it. He said, while we don't have that type of relationship, he says, I think a laugh every few minutes in a film that's supposed to be a tense action adventure is only going to help. He said, audiences want to laugh, and if you take yourself too seriously, it's just the kiss of death, isn't it? Now, Frakes, off the back of Star Trek First Contact, which remains a celebrated and much loved film, would go on to direct 3 more films. Insurrection would be one of them. Then he'd do Clock Stoppers, which is an underrated family film from 2002. But his directorial career would hit the buffer, certainly on the big screen, with 2004's Thunderbirds movie, which I'm going to come to in a future podcast. Since then, he's directed an awful lot of television. Not least, he's back directing Star Trek as well, that he's done episodes of Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, or in fact, on top of a whole bunch of other TV bits and bobs. Now, the Star Trek franchise continues on the big screen. At the point that this podcast has been recorded, Paramount has confirmed that at the end of 2022, a brand new Star Trek film will be shooting with the cast led by Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto. But it's telling that when the 25th anniversary of Star Trek First Contact came around at the end of 2021, the affection was there for it in a way that I don't think has been there for a Star Trek movie since. That Frakes wouldn't enjoy the same success with Insurrection, and he would be passed over for the director's chair of Star Trek Nemesis, as I've covered before in a previous podcast. But Star Trek First Contact was the one, just like The Voyage Home, that hit the sweet spot. It gave something to the fans, it gave something for the non-fans, and also it was a rollicking night out at the pictures. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you so much for listening and for your time. Just a couple of parish notices before I get on with the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about. If you like this podcast and want to support us, we do have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/Simon Brew. Thank you to everyone who supports me there. You get the podcast early pretty much every week. You find out gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes as well. There's a couple of audio exclusives that have gone on there as well. And and also some of the funds from that I then channel not just into resources to help research this podcast, but also into helping give a break to new writers and give them paid writing work. So thank you to everyone supporting me there. Also, if you like this podcast, if you could subscribe to it, that helps independent podcasts such as this enormously, especially when we don't have marketing budgets or such weird things as that. And if you can leave, ideally, a hugely positive review, I'd be very much obliged if you could do that as well. All these things go to help the independents like myself, and it's hugely, hugely appreciated. But I'm going to stop asking for things now, and instead I'm going to go on to that second film. And we're coming a bit more up to date. We're coming to the 2010s. This is a really charming film. I've got an awful lot of time for it. I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story of it the other side of this.
This was fun.
Wait, we haven't even had sex again yet.
I'm just not that kind of girl. I only have sex once on the first date. I'm just going to call an Uber.
Your driver will be ready as soon as he puts on his pants.
Watch and learn, bye. Oh, gosh.
I have to tell you something, babe. I've been dating this girl. She's white. A white girl? Hey, you can't look like you and a white girl.
It's okay. We hate terrorists.
I wonder who that could be.
I'm guessing it's a young, single Pakistani woman.
This is Zubeda.
For your files? Your X-Files? That's your favorite show, huh? The truth is out there.
Are you judging Pakistan's next top model?
You know how we have arranged marriage in my culture?
Oh my god, I'm so stupid.
Can you imagine a world in which we end up together?
I don't know.
Well, we're in the world of a film called The Big Sick there, directed by Michael Showalter, written by Emily V. Gordon and Kamal Nanjiani, starring Nanjiani, Zoe Kazan, Holly Hunter and Ray Romano, and produced by Judd Apatow and Barry Mandel. I'm going to come to them quite a lot in this, so I figure I should name check them here. So the story, I mean, let's go back to Kamal Nanjiani, who started breaking into screen work in America in the early 2010s. That he'd done some stand-up comedy, he'd done some podcast work as well, and podcasting would be pivotal to this story, actually. And he gradually started to pick up some screen work on TV and on film. So the TV show Life as We Know It, for instance. But then he picked up a role or two in films such as The 5-Year Engagement, romcom with Jason Segel, produced by Judd Apatow, that one. He turned up in Kings of Summer, which is a great film. He was in the Cameron Diaz headline Sex Tape. He was in Hot Tub Time Machine. He was in one of the Hot Tub Time Machine movies. He was picking up these small roles, but nothing really that massively cut through at that point. However, along with his podcast work, and that was getting some prominence, he was gradually getting more and more on radar. But the turning point for this project was in 2012 at the South by Southwest Festival in America, where producer Judd Apatow was invited onto a podcast with a man called Pete Holmes, and one of the other guests on that podcast was Nanjiani. Now, Nanjiani and Apatow had crossed on The 5-Year Engagement, which it's a pretty decent rom-com, that, but it didn't do an awful lot of business. But nonetheless, the pair of them got chatting and really found that they were getting on. And Apatow was known for working with comedians and developing material with comedians, and he invited Kamal Nanjiani to get in touch and have a meeting over any ideas that he happened to have. Well, turned out he did happen to have ideas, and of the many ideas for films that he had bubbling away, the one that got to the top of his head was effectively the story of his life, and in particular how he met Emily Gordon, the woman he would ultimately marry. That Gordon had come along to a stand-up gig that Nanjiani was performing at in Chicago and had heckled him, and that was their first conversation. It was from a stage, her heckling from the audience, him replying from the stage, and gradually their relationship came together at that point. But then suddenly she got very, very ill. It nearly at a point where their relationship was over, but she was potentially at death's door at that point. So that was their real life relationship. All this was going on back in 2006, and against that too was the story of a culture clash, that Nanjiani's family were trying to set him up with an arranged marriage at that point, that Emily Gordon was also not looking for a relationship at all, and then, just to add a further complication, as she slipped into a coma, in came her parents to sit with their daughter as she faced a huge health crisis for a very intense 2 weeks that also brought them into Nanjiani's sphere as well. So it was a whole bunch of ingredients there that was going to be tricky to shepherd into a screenplay, but Nanjiani wanted to tell this story on film, that this kind of story that wasn't being told on film. As he would point out in interviews after the film's release, he just said, I've seen loads of films and really loved watching these films of people, in the 1980s of white guys who are finding love and finding romance. He just said, I really, really like them, but wouldn't it be interesting to see one from his perspective as well? And so he took this to the meeting that was arranged with Judd Apatow and producer Barry Mandel. And his pitch at that point involved bringing along real-life souvenirs, really, of a very traumatic part of his life, that paperwork and stick and bits and bobs from around the point where he and Gordon, were thrown together, really, by the most extreme of circumstances. Now, Apatow admitted that he had never heard a story quite like this, and it was a point of his career where he'd come to a lot of prominence at the back end of the 2000s. I mean, I covered Knocked Up on this podcast a little while back, and films like Superbad were hitting big, and he was still having hits now. So Trainwreck had hit big, the 5-year engagement less so, This Is 40 less so, but his films they were getting more mixed responses. They weren't having quite so much raging success at the box office, with a few standout exceptions, but he still had the clout to make things happen and to get films made, just not quite necessarily at the huge studio level he'd had a year or two before. That's not to say he hasn't gone on making films with studios. It's just there were arrangements particularly with the likes of Universal and Sony, where he was getting a lot of films through the system. But Apatow knew from the outset this one was likely to be an independent movie, and so he suggested Kamal Nanjiani went away and penned an outline for the movie, which at first he tried to tackle by himself. Now, he talked, I mean, it's a spoiler of sorts, really, but there's no way around it, and I don't think it takes away from the film in the slightest. But he and Emily Gordon are now married, and so while he was putting together this outline, he was talking to her and getting her input and getting contributions, and he was sending the scripts over to Apatow and Mandel, and they were continuing to develop them. But eventually they decided the logical thing here was to bring Emily V. Gordon in as a co-writer on the movie and to really get her voiced into the text of it. And it was those drafts when Gordon's voice was added that began to turn the project again. This was still not a fast process. I mean, I've just talked about a Star Trek film that shot and was released, 7-8 months after the first shot was in the can. This was 3 years of work on sharpening the script in the case of The Big Sick. And in fact, it was a period of time during which Kamal Nanjiani, off the back of a role in the TV series Silicon Valley, would find fame and would find prominence, the kind of fame and prominence he didn't have at the point this project was initiated. So, Emily Gordon's given an interview or two. They wrote dozens of versions of this screenplay, and she highlighted the problem of nailing just what the film was. She said there were so many ways to go because there were different angles to the story. A struggling comedian, a guy with a Muslim family living in America, a guy with a sick girlfriend, and she said we definitely circled around that for a while. And Barry Mandel added as well, we pushed them really hard, and he admitted that there were times when he just wondered if they were actually going to be able to pull this film off. Did they have it within them to nail the script? Now, eventually they did, but it was a pretty exhaustive process to do so, and they would finally get a draft that people were all excited about and were happy about, and that they felt they were getting somewhere, and then they got even more notes on the draft that they were happy with. So the process just kept going, and it was years and years of work on this. And as Barry Mandel would point out, it's not unusual. He said oftentimes making one aspect of the script better only removes the obstacle to seeing where you really need to go, and it just kept improving. And in fact, the rewrites of this particular one would continue right the way through production, and unusually they would give interviews saying this is a case where the rewrite process was helping, that they weren't serving a big studio master here anyway. This was still an independent film, this was still quite a modest film, and so the rewrites were between themselves as they kept tuning and fighting to make this better and better and better. Now, is their life story, really, or certainly a snapshot of their life story for Kamal Nanjiani and Emily V. Gordon. And they do admit that they took some creative liberties with the story. It's not a documentary by any account, not least with the characters of Emily's parents in the film, Beth and Terry, that in real life they were a lot calmer than the versions we see on screen. They were a lot friendlier. There was a lot less tension to them. But as Judd Apatow put to the pair, here's what you start with. Who are the worst people for this character of Kamal to be stuck in a hospital with for days or weeks? What is the absolute worst version? And he says, you just calibrate it from there. So they fictionalised Emily's parents to a large degree to make them far more of an obstacle and to put far more dramatic tension in there, while still smattering comedy right through a film. Well, there's no way around it. It goes to some very uncomfortable places, particularly in the middle act of this film. I mean, everything is really going to quite potentially a tragic place. And so they were putting jokes in the midst of all of that, but they knew this wasn't quite your conventional rom-com as they were putting it together as well. There were tensions just in the writing of it as well. Just how do you tonally balance a lot of this? Because there was nervousness about how to put across themes of religion and culture in the midst of this film. How do you do that honestly? And in fact, what they decided to do in the end was not to try and go in and have anything particularly to say, but more to be honest and true to their own story. That they focused this firmly on the family story. They didn't want to put cliched versions of both families on the screen. They wanted to show the human side of both of them, which I'd argue they managed to do. And eventually, I mean, it was a 3-year process. They had a screenplay that they felt was working, that they could take out to market. Now, at this point, in spring of 2015, before they sent it out, they started looking around for a director for the movie. Now, several were considered, but it was a man called Michael Showalter who bubbled to the top. A writer, a director, an actor. He'd worked with Judd Apatow before, and he'd come to prominence of things like the Wet Hot American Summer franchise, in which he wrote on. He'd also done a little bit of directing as well. He'd made a film in which he starred called The Baxter in 2005, but it was a movie called My Name is Doris, starring Sally Field in 2015, which had a role for Kamal Nanjiani, as it happened, that really just brought him to attention. That film got some independent award notices and generally was really well received. Now, he'd also done some television stuff, and in fact, he would get a television movie in between My Name is Doris and The Big Sick. But this was still going to be something of a step up for Showalter. He also, even though he'd worked with Kamal Nanjiani before, he wasn't aware of the story of he and Emily V. Gordon. He did love a good rom-com, though. And so when he got the script, he was quickly on board. He liked it. And also Apatow would say, I've been a fan of Michael's as a creator and performer since The State and Wet Hot American Summer. And he said, then I saw Hello, My Name is Doris, and I thought it was incredible. He said what he saw in that film was a very difficult balance of comedy and drama. And he argued there are so few people who can do that. So Kamal and Emily both already knew him. And as Apatow said, we all thought Mike was the perfect person for this. However, bringing on another member of the creative team also led to more changes, because Showalter was a writer as well. And so work began again on just tuning the screenplay and working with the script and building it and making it better. That was more months of work that was added. And all the while, Kamal Nanjiani's star was rising. But finally, on Friday, November the 6th, 2015, they decided this is it. We've got to send this out. We've got to see if anyone is interested in funding the movie. And so they decided to email it to a series of studios and companies who funded independent films, and click send. And within hours, Film Nation came in with the money. Now, it was only $5 million worth of money. That's the production budget for this film. But they were in. And I mean, other studios were coming, and Fox Searchlight came in fairly quickly, but Film Nation had reacted so quickly and had shown such confidence in it that they decided to go with their offer. And this was announced to market in the trade paper Deadline in December, where it said the Big Sick is supremely funny, human and relatable on so many levels. This is the chief executive of Film Night, Glenn Basner, and he said, with a comedic dream team led by Judd Apatow, Barry Mandel, Michael Showalter and Kamal Nanjiani, audiences worldwide are going to laugh their asses off. I know I did. So this was happening. I mean, there was no way back now. And casting-wise, I mean, it was always known that Nanjiani was going to co-star in this, effectively playing himself, a younger version of himself. But then auditions began for the character of Emily in the film, who would not be played by Emily V. Gordon, and instead it was Zoe Kazan who bubbled to the top of the auditions. Now, Emily Gordon wasn't at the auditions, but Kazan came in and nailed it, and they were happy with her, and she was quickly on board. At the point that she was on board, more script changes, because Kazan then started working with Emily Gordon and they kept tuning it again. The conversations between the pair led to the screenplay evolving. And then in came some highbrow talent as well, some high profile talent. Oscar winner Holly Hunter, she was on board. Ray Romano, one of America's biggest TV sitcom stars at that point, off the back of Everyone Loves Raymond, they would take roles on. Now, Holly Hunter decided not to go and talk to Emily's real parents while she was preparing for the role, but they were coming together, they were talking, they were moving on. And then Anupam Kher was the last on board. That he came to the film, I think it was at the suggestion of Kamal Nanjiani's own father, to play his dad, that he was added to the cast in June of 2016, or at least that's when the announcement came out, after filming had begun. And I have to do a shout out for the brilliant Adil Akhtar as well, who had risen to movie comedy prominence off the back of the film Four Lions, and at the point of recording he's up for a BAFTA for his role in the brilliant Ali and Ava. He chased a role in this one. Barry Mandel was already familiar with him, and he duly joined the ensemble as well. Filming could begin on May the 11th, 2016. That he was going to use the Chicago area. It was a $5 million budget. There wasn't much to play with here, and this was a small, nimble production. That there were rehearsals for it. I mean, they don't cost an awful lot of money, and those rehearsals again were informing changes to the script. But Showalter on the set, I mean, it was said to be a happy set, this one, that room was left for improvisation, for exploring characters, for trying things, for giving things a go. Now, Ray Romano, apart from being one of, at that point, America's most famous comedy actors, he would admit that he was nervous about working opposite someone like Holly Hunter. But again, the pair quickly found a tempo, and the feeling was this was a calm, happy production. In fact, the only tumultuous moment I could find during the shoot of the film came with a visa problem for Anupam Kher, who they'd put aside some time to rehearse the film and to bring Kher in for the moments with Kamal Nanjiani's family. They wanted to get those right, but he was held up by his visa, and so at the point they were actually able to get him on set, they only had 3 days total to film all the scenes round the table with Kamal Nanjiani's family. And so it really was a bit of an all hands on deck moment there, but they were able to do it, and they were able to put across that this was a proper family unit, and it all worked out. Now, filming would wrap up, it was a 6-week shoot really, on June the 20th, 2015 for this one. Several early cuts were put together and prepared, and it was Leslie Mann, the actor Leslie Mann, who's married to Judd Apatow as well, who suggested rounding off the movie with pictures of the real life people involved in the film. And they got a cut together that they were happy with, and they were confident enough to take to the Sundance Film Festival in January 2017. In fact, the film would debut on January the 20th, 2017 there. But what it didn't have at that point was distribution. It's one of many films that would go to Sundance looking for a buyer to put it out to a broader audience. I mean, I've talked about the film Blinded by the Light on this podcast before. That was in a similar boat, that it needed someone to stump up for the distribution. The Big Sick was very much in that position as well. Now, the reception to the film off the back of its Sundance debut was really, really, really strong. very, very funny, very, very heartfelt, and also it's just a slightly different angle on the kind of rom-coms that Hollywood have been giving us for years. In fact, the rom-com, if anything, had fallen a little bit out of favour at the point of this being recorded. It's still a little bit out of favour, although the Jennifer Lopez headline "Marry Me" has just come out. But The Big Sick felt different. It still feels different. I rewatched it ahead of recording this podcast, and I mean, find me anything quite like it that's come out since. It's an awful lot of ingredients in there. A really sweet film that goes to some very, very difficult places as well. The film was duly acclaimed. That there are a couple of people who weren't quite as keen on it, but they were in the minority of this one. And so a bidding war broke out for the movie, and in the end Amazon paid $12 million for the rights to distribute the film. It beat out offers from traditional studios on that one. It then did a deal with Lionsgate to give the movie a wide theatrical release in the US. A similar deal was struck with Studio Canal to get it out in cinemas in the UK as well. But The Big Sick was in profit before it had even seen the inside of a cinema, that Amazon had comfortably doubled its production costs. So the film would get its wide release in the US on June the 23rd, 2017, and it would be a slow rollout release. That it opened only on 5 screens that weekend, and as such it opened right the way down the chart in 18th place, but with a huge screen average. So it got $421 million on its opening weekend, but an average of $84,000 per screen. The top film that week, which had also opened the same day, was Transformers: The Last Night, which had got a $10,980 screen average and had opened with $68 million. The Big Sick a long way behind, but the way smaller films work is you gradually up the screen count, and the following week Lionsgate added it, so it was playing in 70 screens around the US, and then the following week it added a few more. It's up to 326, and there the film's creeping into the top 10. And so by the time we get to mid-July, The Big Sick, while a film like War for the Planet of the Apes comes out and opens on 4,000 screens, has earned its way up to 2,500 screens, and its box office just continued to grow. Now, it was a competitive summer. Films like Dunkirk, Valerian, even the Emoji Movie, crikey, were following the weeks after. So Big Sick was never going to be a massive blockbuster, but it was a surprise hit. $42 million in the US, another $13 million outside of the US, a comfortable box office take of $56.4 million for a $5 million independent movie made outside of the studio system. And the acclaim for it wasn't done either. That the movie would pick up an Academy Award nomination for its screenplay. It would notably be snubbed by the Golden Globes, which led to Kumail Nanjiani having some fun with his Twitter account and tweeting things like, "The to and fro began earlier today with the Golden Globes snubbing of Nanjiani's terrific The Big Sick." This is his tweet. Prompting this tweet from his page, he said, "Hi gang, this is Steven Spielberg tweeting from Kumail's phone. My fave movie this year was The Big Sick. It's available on Amazon Prime and iTunes and all that. Great movie to watch with the fam. I know I watched it with my fam, the Spielbergs, and we all loved it." Handing phone back to Kumail now. This caused a little bit of to and fro in the Hollywood trade press at one point. I don't think he was actually suggesting Steven Spielberg had nicked his phone, but it'd be hilarious if he did. But it all just played to the narrative of this underdog film, really, that had poked its head above the parapet, that had found an audience, that continues to find an audience, and it's available on streaming services now. It's one of the most successful independent films of the back end of the 2010s, and if you've not had the pleasure of it, it really is quite something. An achievement and a half, really, that had taken a long time to come together, yet alone live through, and had gone on to be a success. Kumail Nanjiani, since, of course, has now turned up in high-profile films such as Marvel's Eternals, but I think this is his best film, but I think this is a very special film as well, and I do urge you to seek it out. Which brings me to the end of this episode of Film Stories. Thank you so much for listening and for putting up with me. If I've not bored you to death, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. Film Stories is on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. Now, we've got websites. Filmstories.co.uk is updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, opinions, mayhem, all sorts of bits and bobs. If you go to our shops, store.filmstories.co.uk. That's where you can buy back issues of our magazines and pre-order the next issue of our magazines as well. We've got some announcements coming up there very, very shortly. And if you want to hear me in person, you live near the West Midlands in the UK, then on March the 30th, 2022, I'm live at the Midlands Arts Centre with my Movie Geek live show. Tickets for that on sale now. You can find more at filmstories.co.uk on that. Most important thing now, though, is that you all look after yourselves and that you're all well. I thank you so much for your time. I thank you so much for listening. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye-bye.
I am Locutus of Borg. Resistance is futile.